Good morning. This morning we're going to examine naming conventions. And to do that, I'm going to take you on a tour through a number of my furniture pieces. The first one we're going to start with is the bedside table. You've seen this probably in my beginner's tutorial. I've used it in a few other posts that I've made on American Woodworker. And we'll begin with the perspective view. The perspective view is one I include in most of my models. The advantage of the perspective view, of course, is that the drawn model looks very similar to the way the eye would see the object in real life. And so it's primarily intended for the customer or whoever the piece is being built for to get a modeled view of what it's going to look like in the end. Therefore, it's usually textured. But you'll find that it's the perspective view I use for this purpose and only this purpose, and it never appears. The perspective view never appears in any of my other scenes. But just to get a little nomenclature down here, scenes are the tabs you see along the top here. Perspective, front view, side view, legs, back, etc. You can view them with these tabs. One of the problems with this, of course, is if you have a lot of scenes, you have to use these little arrow keys to move the scenes along. The other way you can view scenes is with the scenes dialog box. I'll try to bring this up here so that you can see the whole thing. These are also the scenes: perspective, front view, side view, legs, back, sides, etc. And they're in list form. You can also view them in thumbnail views, either large or small, but I prefer the list. You can also view them in detail, by the way, and it gives you a little, if you choose to put a description on these or a photo, you can see that as well. But I prefer to look at these in the list view. Okay, now the other thing we're going to concern ourselves with is layers. And this is the old layers dialog box you're probably very familiar with. They have radio buttons preceding the names of the layers. You should never, ever, ever select any of these radio buttons. It should always be layer 0, but that's the topic of the subject of another post. In the layers dialog box, you'll see the visible column, and when it's checked, it means that that layer is being drawn. If it's unchecked, whatever is on that layer you can't see in the visible window. Let's look at one other dialog box that will be important to us today. The outliner. By the way, I should mention that all of these dialog boxes can be obtained in the window menu, at least on the PC. And in the window menu, you can see layer, outliner, scenes. There's a lot of other dialog boxes, that most of which we aren't going to deal with today. But one other is the entity info. This gives you the information about a particular component. We're going to deal with that today too. Okay, so those are the primary dialog boxes. And by the way, notice in this outliner two things. One, you have some names that don't have brackets and some names that have brackets. The names inside the brackets are the component names, or what might be called the definition name, the component definition name. It's a little confusing, and I'll try to point that out as we go along, and maybe try and straighten it out for you. But just remember that inside the brackets is the component name. Outside the brackets is the instance name. So you may have more than one of the same component with different instance names. Where that might happen, for instance, is, let's look at side. In fact, if I type something up here, it'll filter things for me. Let me type side. Notice when I type side, I have a draw side, a draw side, and a side. These two side components are exactly the same component. One is the left side and the other is the right side. In other words, the instance name is left side. The component name is side, and this is the right side. side. The two components are identical. They may be mirrored or rotated or something like that, but they're identical components. The same is true here with the draw sides. There are two draw sides, left draw side, right draw side. They're identical components, but there's two instances, the left one and the right one. So you can use the outliner for filtering this way, and we'll use it a little bit today in that regard. I'll just bring this offline. Okay, getting back to what we're talking about today, which is naming conventions. I always start my models off with probably 2 or 3 or 4 of the same type of view. I already mentioned the perspective view. That's always my first view. And then generally I have a front view. And the front view is the isometric or parallel projection view straight on. In other words, the front view straight on, so that I can dimension the overall dimensions of this thing, because that's an important part of the model, knowing what this thing is going to be overall, how tall it's going to stand, how wide it is, how deep. And I generally have a side view. It does the same thing, but from the side view. Top views and bottom views I find most of the time aren't needed, but if they are, I'll put them there, and those will be my first 3, 4, or 5 views. After that, everything is generally isometric in some way, shape, or form. There may be front views, side views, and so on and so forth, but it turns out that with the isometric view, you can get more faces in the view than just front or side. You can get 3 faces like this, and so I can dimension it in 3 dimensions. Now what I want to do is, I'll just point out a few of these. You could put notes on these and things like that, but the important part to look at here, I'm going to step back and go over this again. What I want you to do is look at the layers dialog box as I step through a few of these. Notice that for the perspective view, I've got all views visible. There are no dimension views. These views down here, which are preceded with Z, are dimension views. And as I explained in part 1, the purpose of putting the Z down here is, it sounds like dimension, but it also puts things at the end of the alphabetical list, so that most of the time I want to be able to play with things that are components, and they're right up top here. They're not out of order, and they're in alphabetical order, and they're right up top. But notice as I go through the views, this has the same check boxes as the perspective view. But if I look down here further, notice also the Z overall front is selected. Z overall front means the overall dimensions for the front view. And that's the front view. So what I did was I selected all of these layers, and in addition a dimension layer. The side view, very similar. I've selected all of these layers that have the components on them, and in addition I have the Z overall side layer selected. Now let's look at the legs layer. Now notice I only have one layer visible, legs layer, and let me move this over, and the Z leg, the dimensions for the legs. So this view is made up of 2 visible layers. Most of the time that's the case, with the exception of these lead-in views, which include all the components. Most of the time I'm trying to dimension just one part. So I'll have one part selected and one dimension layer. Now notice that this is the back layer. It has the back on it, the component back, and its dimensions are on a Z back layer. This makes it easy for me to understand how things are paired. If I want to look at For instance, if I want to look at the lower rail, and I choose that, it's simply a combination of the lower rail layer and the lower rail Z layer, dimension layer. Let's see if there's any others that we want to look at here. This is sort of an arrangement view. This view just tells the user how these parts tend to fit together and how to align them. Let's see what I've done for this. What I've done is I've taken the lower rail layer. Here's the lower rail. The sliders. Here's the sliders. And the styles. There are two styles here and here. And I've chosen those layers along with a layer called Z slider arrangement. And instead of dimensions on this layer, by the way, I simply have labels on that layer. I could have perhaps preceded this with an L, but that would have thrown it up in the upper top of this, up here around the legs, and started to confuse things. So I kept the Z down here to keep it down in the lower levels and keep it out of the upper levels of components. But you can see that this view is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. And that's exactly what a view is. Think of views as an equation. The name of the view, in this case slider arrangement, is equal to lower rail plus sliders plus styles plus Z side slider arrangement. Because that's really what a view is. We'll get into what else is in a view in a moment. Okay, I want to review a few things here just to make sure you understand what's going on. I tend to put one component on per layer. Now there may be more than one instance of a component on the layer. For instance, if I look at the legs layer, well, let me just look at it this way. There we go. And I'll bring in the entity info box. Choose this leg. Notice that that leg has the definition name or component name of front leg. But this is the left front leg. That's the instance name, the instance of that component. I have two instances of that component. I have another front leg over here. It's identical to this one, just mirrored. It's called the front leg component, and it's the right front leg instance. I happen to have two components on this layer, the legs layer. And that's because this component is called the back leg, and it's very similar to the front leg. Not exact, but similar. So I've got them on the same layer, and I call it the legs layer. I'll just bring this in. You can see the legs layer. It's got all 4 legs on it, of which there are 2 components, back leg and front leg, and 2 instances per component. But in general, I try to keep one component on a layer. And I'll name the layer, typically the name of the component or the plural of the component, legs. Okay, and you can see that up here, by the way. That's the legs layer that this component resides on. All right, now we're going to look at another model. This is a shaker tall clock. I start off again with the typical perspective view, front view and side view. But what I want to look at here is something called the X-ray view. Here it is right here. Notice what I've got turned on here is the X-ray tool, because in this particular view I wanted to be able to see what's inside of all these components. And then I could apply notes and explain to the person who might be building this exactly what all this means. To do this, I again had an X-ray base bottom layer. Notice I preceded it with X. Again, what that does is puts things at the bottom of the list, because typically parts don't start with the letter X. So it keeps it out of the part portion of the layers. And it's also consistent with X-ray. And notice I followed that with base bottom. So that's selected. And what I did was, because this is an exploded X-ray view, I made a copy of all of the components and put it on that same layer. So in this case, all of the components are on the X-ray layer, as well as the labeling. So I only have one layer selected for this particular view. That means in this model, there are, instead of having a left mortise base and a right mortise base, I've got two of them. One for the perspective view, or the whole model, and one for this very specific layer that is doing something that's a little different, which is an exploded view that's X-rayed. Let's see if we can find some other similar issues. Here's another scene. This one's called Hood. And what it is, it's a combination of an exploded hood view, also though with a complete assembled hood up here to show you what the assembled hood looks like alongside the exploded hood. To do this, what I did was I made two copies of the hood, moved it to another layer called the exploded hood layer, X for exploded, or X for X-ray. And after making two copies of that hood, I exploded one of them and labeled it. So now on one layer only in this particular view, I have an exploded hood and an assembled hood, so the viewer of this model can get an idea how this goes together. Let's look for some other examples. Here's an example where in this particular design, the clock, where you place the trim is critical, because placement of the trim actually determines where the dial will end up. And so if you don't get it right, the dial will not be centered. The hands will not be centered where they're supposed to be. So the placement of the trim becomes very critical. The hood actually rests on the trim on top. So in order to make sure that in the end the trim is placed in the appropriate places, we needed this skeletal structure of the clock to demonstrate it. And in order to do that, what I did was I chose some number of layers, quite a few in this case, not all of them, but quite a few, along with an X-cove trim placement layer, X for placement in this case. And we provided the dimensions as to where the actual cove trim was supposed to be placed. Let's go back and look at the overall layout of this particular model. Again, to repeat myself, I had started out with the standard views in the front, the perspective front and side, and then went to some more detailed views. But notice as you go on, I've got this D, front foot. Well, D stands for dimension. I could have put Z there, but I thought Z would be more confusing, so I led the dimension layers off with D front foot. But if you look at what layers are actually chosen for D front foot, it's actually a Z layer. The Z, as I said, keeps things on the bottom here. If I chose D dash front foot, it would have been placed up here in the hierarchy of the components. So to make the tab naming a little easier to understand, I put D. X-ray, as I said, I led off with X-ray, as opposed to X for exploded. Now I want to look at another model. I'm going to look at a cabinet model. This model was drawn by a student of mine, and as such, it doesn't completely follow my strategy for naming. He has chosen his own, but he starts off similar with perspective views, and he uses several perspective views, one without a countertop, one with it, one with doors open, one with a drawer open. And then he gets to the side and front views. But the interesting thing about this is, let's go back and look at the entire model. Is to look at the naming convention. Notice the name base here. What base refers to is something I might call carcass in furniture design. It is the box of the cabinet. The base or box of the cabinet has a back, a bottom trim, a shelf, and sides. It also has some stretchers on the top to hold the sides together. And so that's one subassembly called the base, or the box of the cabinet. The countertop is another subassembly. The door is another subassembly. A drawer, a subassembly. Then he has some exploded views. A face frame, a ladder base. The ladder base is where the toe kick is created. And some side panels. And then he uses the Z naming convention for dimensions. And so what I really want to point out here is that you can keep your subassemblies visible and easily accessible by simply, prefixing the part names with the subassembly name. It doesn't change the name of the actual individual component. For instance, if I look at base bottom, let me clear everything here. Look at base bottom. That really is the bottom, and if I bring in the entity info, it's the bottom, but it's on the base bottom layer because it's part of the base. If I choose all of the base layers, what I've got is the box. And so by simply prefixing your parts with the subassembly they belong to, you can easily get at a subassembly by just clicking, and in alphabetical order. They'll all be next to each other. So all you need to do is click all the bases and you get the subassembly. So that's another reason for this strategy of prefixing components with a subassembly name. Now we're going to look at a final model that does this in a slightly different way. This is the model of a home. It's not complete yet, but if it were complete and I selected the All tab, you would see the siding and the windows and all of that. I don't have it complete, so the All tab doesn't include all that stuff yet, but it includes everything that I've got so far. And then I've got a first floor plan, second floor plan, footing, foundation, footing and foundation, cement floors, and this just goes on and on like this until this is the sill plan. Now the beams, sill first floor with beams and girders, first floor joists and rim boards, first floor studding. Okay, so this goes on and on and on and on. But here's the important part. If I look at an individual part here, like let's take a stud. This component is a full-length wall stud. So what would an instance name of a wall stud mean to somebody? Is it the first wall stud in the wall, the second wall stud in the wall, the third wall stud? What does that mean? It has no meaning. What does have meaning is its definition name, which says it's a pre-cut stud. It's a 2x4, 92 5/8 inches long. That's a meaningful name for this component. And the one right next to it would be exactly the same. The instance name has no meaning, and so you don't find it here. Similarly, naming things in subassemblies don't make sense. When you're constructing a home, you don't have something called a bathroom as a subassembly, or a master bedroom as a subassembly, or a lounge as a subassembly. These aren't subassemblies in home building. What tend to be something that sort of approach the idea of a subassembly are things like first floor, second floor, cellar, deck, foundation, garage floor, garage footing, house footing, lolly columns. These tend to approach what we would normally think of as subassemblies. So that's what I've chosen for the layer names that precede components. So for instance, if I want to look at the first floor rafters, all I need to do is I'll clear everything and choose first floor rafters. Now if I zoom in, that's all the rafters on the first floor. If I want to choose the second floor rafters, now you begin to see the roof outline of this house. Okay, so in this case, subassemblies tend to be the floor or the structure. Whereas in furniture, the subassemblies tend to be things like drawers, the carcass, or something like that. If you're doing a grandfather clock, it would be the waist, the base, the hood, or something like that. Okay, that's sort of the last model we're going to look at here. Oh, I would like to point out one other thing. As we were stepping through these views, for instance, the sill with the first floor beams and girders. And if I zoom in here, you will see the sill is laid down on the foundation. There's the first floor beams and girders. There's also a little studding down here for the stairs in the basement. But again, you will notice these are nothing but a logical equation for layers. We have the first floor beams, first floor girders, cellar floor, cellar stairway. I could have left that one out if I didn't want to show any carpentry here. Foundation, garage floor, garage footing, house footing, and so on and so forth. So I've got simply the layers that make up this view are visible and selected. Now when you create a view, the way you do it is you choose the things you want in the view. You organize the view the way you want it to appear. So for instance, I might have said I wanted a front ISO view, and I want it to be completely within the window, so I hit zoom extents. And now I can right click on this tab and say update view. You learned in the beginner's tutorial how to create views, so I'm not going to go through that again. But I guess what I want you to understand is that views are made up of something. And to see that better, I'm going to bring in the Scenes dialog box here. And if I choose that view and open up the extended dialog box, let me see if I can get the whole thing on here. There we go. The other thing views are made up of are down here. When I click the extended or hide details or open details, I get this information down here for a view. And what I've got checked here is everything, which says include in animation. So in other words, when I go between views and things are animated, the transition's animated, that's chosen here. Save the property, save the location of the camera properties. If there are any hidden geometry selected, show that. Show visible layers. Show active section planes. If I were doing a section of this house, and I will when it's finally done, there will be a number of sections of the house. Those sections will be visible. I probably will not have style and fog and all of that visible, shadows and things like that, but I just left these checked anyway. And axis location. So I can turn on and turn off the axis and see the axis location. So these also make up views. So when I simplify it by saying thinking of views as an equation, I'm leaving out this little detail here, but now you know it exists and where to find it and how to set it. Okay, this pretty much concludes what I want to cover today. And it gives you hopefully a good idea of how I've used my naming conventions that I outlined in part 1 in some real models, and how those naming conventions help me to find things very quickly. Whatever I want to find, I can find them very quickly. If I know they're on the second floor, or if I know it's part of the roof, I can find those things very, very quickly. Okay, thank you and have a good day.